Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on education, science, and technology, which is happening at the SADC Youth Forum, Mozambique. But because of the COVID-19 situation we are in, this forum is happening virtually. So my name is Julie Juma. I work with ActionAid International as the Global Education Program Manager, and I'm based in Malawi. Good afternoon, everyone. Facilitating this session. We are very happy to be partnering with SIOF and other partners in this youth forum. So we practically have only an hour for this session. So we will try as much as possible to catch up on time. We've already lost 8 minutes as it is. So how we're going to proceed is those who are not speaking, please, I would like to request that you put your mics on mute. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and then towards the end of the presentations, we will respond. The panelists will be able to respond to your questions. There's a closing session at 3, so we need to ensure that we finish on time. So this session on education, science, and technology will focus on how to build back better the education system post-COVID-19 and ensure that no youth is left behind, with a specific focus on financing of education and remote learning. So this was decided by the Education, Science, and Technology Committee, led by the co-chairs, Pearl Ketemoge and Zirevo Chisadza. So we were linking up with them. They are the ones who wanted us to discuss this, as it's something that them as a committee discussed. So just to give a bit of a background, that according to UNESCO, at the peak of the pandemic, schools were closed in over 190 countries, affecting approximately 1.5 billion children. And out of these, 763 million were girls. So already before the pandemic, there were 258 million children who were already out of school, including 9 million girls who had never set foot in a classroom. And currently it's estimated that between 10 million and 30 million girls may not return to education when schools reopen, with dropouts attributed to a range of factors. These include poverty, early pregnancy, early marriage. We already have some alarming figures that are coming out from Malawi and Kenya of the early pregnancies and HIV. So some of these children who have been out of school have continued learning after schools were closed, whereas others did not. So for those of you who participated in the Youth Parliament, their theme was Born into Debt, Young People's Future Under Threat. So they talked about how debt is constraining government's ability to adequately fund public services like education and health. So during our session, we are going to hear a bit more about this. Just to give you a few figures about the debt situation, just a few of the SADC countries. So Zambia spends more on debt servicing than on education and health combined. In 2019, Malawi and Tanzania spent 20% of their government revenue on debt servicing, with Mozambique spending 25% and Zambia spending 51% on paying debts. So Africa's outstanding public debt was 1,330 billion in 2019, which is 57% of the continent's gross domestic product. And now it stands at 500 billion. So you can see this is very alarming. The debt situation is really alarming for Africa. And this has an impact on education financing. And post-COVID, we are expecting that 200 billion will be cut from education budgets next year, owing to declines in GDP. There's therefore need for countries to safeguard the financing of education. So having said this, I would like to call upon our first presenter. We have requested Amel Silva from the Comoros to talk about her experiences during the school closures in the Comoros, so that she sets the scene for the discussions that are going to follow. So Amel Silva is passionate about education, women development, children and youth. She's a committed soccer player in the Women's League of Soccer in Comoros. She envisions an Africa that empowers its youth into leadership. She works with Imara, which is I'm a radical African, and she's also the country director of SADC Comoros chapter. So Amel, over to you to share your experiences.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Dear colleagues, dear guests, good afternoon, and Happy Youth Day. We are still on the month of the youth, so we still Happy Youth Day to everyone. Okay, I'm a senior student at the University of Comoros. We all know that due to the coronavirus, all schools have been closed, and all students have been affected. But as a senior student, I was really focusing on my experience as adult, and I could like manage to do research on what we're learning. But we could say, how about how we youth who can help the children who are really most affected on this closure? Taking experiences about what is happening in Comoros, due to the closure, many young girls and boys have been raped. It's 30% before the COVID-19, the rate of rape in Comoros. And since the closure of school, the rape has increased into 76%. So this is to show that how the impact of the coronavirus in the country. Talking about me, like we closed the school on February, and we come back on July 1st, and we had to study 1 month, equivalent of 6 months we should learn to finish our year study. 1 month couldn't really gather everything we had to learn for 6 months, but we didn't have any choices because the government has to validate our years so that those who get their baccalaureate this year, when they come, they will have where to study. Because if they don't validate our year, those who will come next year, they won't have any room at the university to study. So they had to validate our year in a way that they can. So what they did is to give us only 1 month to study. That wasn't really fair, but we couldn't have any choices, and we accepted and we did it. But before that, they have started like wanted us to learn on WhatsApp, because we live in a country where we don't have a lot of network, we don't have a lot of materials and tools to do e-learning. But when we started the WhatsApp learning classes, most of our students couldn't follow the classes because there are those who don't have phone, there are those who are living in remote villages where they don't have access to internet. So we students have to boycott and tell the teachers, if not all the 15 students are attending the class, we are not going to attend, because this is not about those who live in the capital city or the urban areas, but this is about everyone. We are all affected by this. So if we are looking for a solution, we should look for a solution that will be benefits for everyone. So we students, we boycott the class because it wasn't everyone who couldn't attend it. And the teacher at the beginning, they didn't accept that, but they couldn't do anything because we weren't attending the classes. So that is showing that we young people can take decision, because as we saw that there are other students like us who weren't benefiting the solution that were given by the dean of the department. So we boycotted for the benefit of everyone. So everyone were studying. So that was good. That's good, but no one was left behind. So if we are looking in Africa that is sustainable, that is better for everyone, we have to look in a way to include everyone. If we are looking for a solution, we should look for a solution where everyone should be included, not leaving anyone behind. So I'm calling to young people on this day to help our young sisters and brothers who are in remote villages with what we can, because the little we can, it can give a big impact. It can change a lot. So we have to be committed and support one another for a better Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amer, for raising those very good points of the inequalities that are there as regards to the remote learning and how action needs to be taken to ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you very much for setting the scene for our panelists. Now I will call upon Yandura Chipeta, who is going to talk about education financing and remote learning during school closures. Yandura is the program specialist for accountability and public services with ActionAid Malawi. She's an avid feminist and education activist. She has over 10 years experience in the development sector, focusing on education, gender, and human rights. She is a trustee for the Civil Society Education Coalition in Malawi, and she's also been key in ActionAid's policy advocacy work on financing for quality education. She has contributed to research papers such as Citizens Education Report and the Who Cares for the Future report, Financing Gender Responsive Public Services for 2020. She has also been a panelist at the 2019 Financing for Development Forum in New York, presenting at a panel session on progressive taxation and equality. Over to you now, Yandura.
Thank you so much, Julie. Welcome, everyone. My presentation today is focusing on education financing and debt, and particularly I'm focusing on Malawi and also how the education sector has been affected due to COVID-19. Briefly, as a matter of a status update or introduction, number one, it should be very clear to all of us that the right to education is one which every state, as in every government, has an obligation to deliver on quality education. And as a result, governments have made commitments in terms of what is the minimum amount or allocations they need to allocate to the education sector and other public services. So the Indian framework provides a guideline in that governments should spend at least a minimum of 4 to 6% of the GDP on education, which translates to 15 to 20% allocation of public expenditure to the sector. And investment in education is key to human capital development in our countries and in Africa and in the SADC region in particular, and also the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this can only be achieved through the provision of quality, accessible, and relevant education. However, there are a number of challenges in the sector, and these cannot be digressed from financing. And these include issues of access, and it cuts across the board from primary to secondary and tertiary education, including vocational skills, infrastructure challenges in all sectors of education, as well as limited professional capacity in relation to qualified or trained personnel to deliver, and also the provision of teaching and learning materials. Malawi closed schools in March, on 23rd of March, when we registered the first case of COVID. And that meant that all education institutions were closed when a state of emergency was declared by the president. And immediately government started looking at how can we ensure continued learning in all sectors, but the progress was really slow, and it remains slow to date. Radio programs were then identified as one model of reaching out for continued learning, and it was only effected after 2 months since the closure of schools, and this only was meant for primary education. And online lessons were proposed for secondary education, but the content that was readily available was only for the lower classes, which are forms 1 and 2. But that also brought in its own issues in terms of access to internet facilities for the learners, especially those from poor households and also in remote areas, especially rural areas. And lessons for forms 3 and 4, which are the upper classes of secondary school, to date have still not yet been uploaded as part of an online learning. So it means that for the past 4 months, the senior secondary school classes, they have not been able to access continued education in the midst of an emergency like the current pandemic we're in. We saw some positive trends in that government trying to promote partnership with the private sector, and that involved the mobile telecommunication companies, so that they provide reduced data tariffs for the school-related websites. And that was good, but there's still more that needed to be done. And the current pandemic has actually shown that inequalities do exist within the provision of education in terms of access, and also how that then translates to the learning outcomes. And we have seen a deepening of the rural-urban divide, because learners from the rural areas have really not had much access, starting from the radios, in that some families don't even have the radios in the first place, and also how children in poor families, their access to remote learning facilities has also been very limited compared to their counterparts from rich families. And also for learners with special needs who cannot necessarily be able to access the radio listening sessions or the online facilities. So that also has shown the widening inequality gap among the different status among learners and students, both at tertiary, primary and secondary level. And with tertiary education, it's only now that government has announced that the tertiary sector will open using online facilities, but it should not have taken 4 months for that to happen. In terms of financing, the government of Malawi has considerably invested in the education sector, and we have seen a steady increase in terms of its allocation to the education sector, dating back from 2016-2017, when the government started allocating beyond 20%, and in the last financial year, government allocated up to 25% of finances to the education sector. And that translated to about 7% of the GDP. And comparing Malawi with other SADC countries, Malawi's allocation was relatively higher. And in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, we see an average of around 5% of GDP allocated to education. However, despite the increments in allocation of finances, we still see that the money is not adequate to address the gaps within the education sector. And this has also been exacerbated by austerity measures and the wage bill caps that have been imposed upon by the IMF. And we have also seen that the government of Malawi is spending a considerable large amount of money in paying off public debt. And that includes both domestic and international debt. Over time, we have seen that the public debt charges are the second largest share in the national budget. And in the 2018-2019 budget, 2019-2020, we see an allocation of 14.1% of resources just to public debt repayment. And we have seen that the value of public debt as of now is standing at around 68.2% of Malawi's GDP, which means that slowly the country is getting into moderate debt distress. And that means that funding for public services like education continues to decline because huge amounts of money are being invested in paying off debts. In terms of the recommendations that we can provide to the government in relation to them being able to provide quality, equitable, and accessible education, inclusive education for all, include number one, that government should exceedingly look at increasing the size of the national budget through progressive taxation, which will in turn increase the share of the education budget, and especially in the critical development areas within education. And that there is also need for the education budget to be sensitive to promote inclusion and equity in the principle of leaving no one behind, and that young people and communities should be able to scrutinize education budgets to ensure that the money indeed reaches the people that it targeted to reach, and that education should be publicly delivered. We are seeing within Africa the trend on privatization of education, but that is not what we should propose for, because the provision of education is a core human right, and government or states are obligated to provide that. So there is need for meaningful decentralization and public delivery of education, and that education should be gender equitable and inclusive, and quality should be enhanced in terms of the provision of education in relation to human rights standards, in that it should be accessible to all and available, as well as adaptable and acceptable. And there is need to also close the digital divide. And I think COVID-19 is also an opportunity, because it has shown the gap that is there, the inequality gap among the rich and the poor, and those that are in the rural and urban areas. So briefly, that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yandura. You have raised very good points in that presentation, highlighting the debt situation as well as the financing situation for Malawi. So Malawi has been allocating the recommended 20% and above benchmark of financing of education. But due to debt servicing, the size of the overall budget is still small, and there is need to ensure that the size of the budget is increased. Thank you so much, Yandura. We'll now move on to our next panelist, who is Kapfuma Ronald Jongwe, who is an education specialist and development consultant with more than 12 years experience in program coordination and providing overall strategic guidance in the implementation of different development projects and programs within the international development, non-governmental and civil society sectors, with a specific focus on education and youth programs. He's a trained organization and capacity development facilitator with interest and experience in strategic planning, group coordination, team building, and training and capacity development. So Ronald is going to talk about safeguarding education financing post-COVID as we build back better, and also he will touch on the role of educators. So over to you, Ronald.
Thank you, Julie. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. And thank you very much to the organizers for awarding me this opportunity. I realized that some of the key points, that I had prepared, Yantura Education financing is concerned. I think I'll just revert back to some of the issues she touched on, in as far as sticking to international benchmarks that our SADC countries are state parties to. These are declarations like the Incheon Declaration, the Dakar Framework for Education, which give the benchmarks in as far as how much of national budgets are supposed to go towards education, or allocation of GDP, what Yantura was speaking to. And she touched on some key points to say, within SADC we have seen of late a progressive increase in education budgets, towards the benchmark, either 20% or as a percentage of GDP, which is 4 to 6%. But when you look in terms of GDP, you realize that we are still within the 4%. And just to reiterate what the previous speaker said, to say if our countries were not burdened by debt per se, and servicing of debt, you would realize that perhaps their contribution to education could be more, because then they could move maybe from the current 4.7% of GDP, the 4.3, or the average 5%, that Yantura was talking about, perhaps to around 5.5% to 6% of GDP as commitment towards education expenditure. And as we move post-COVID, which is the focus of the discussion, I think one role that we can play as young people is to pressure our respective governments to say perhaps they still need to stick to these benchmarks. Funding to education as we move post-COVID, if we are to look at sustainability and regaining the time that learners have lost, there is definitely need for an increased budget allocation towards education. So there is need for our governments to really look into that. I will not belabor those points because Yantura touched on that, but maybe one issue that I want to look at in as far as education financing is concerned is the issue of inclusivity and safeguarding learners from poor backgrounds. I think this is a key point that government needs to look at, particularly when you look at it from the point that a lot of families have lost their livelihoods, or their livelihoods have been affected by COVID-19. Here in Zimbabwe, there has been lockdown. In South Africa, there is a lockdown. I think in most SADC countries, we have seen lockdowns, and this has affected people, especially those from poor backgrounds, people from the informal sector. And ultimately, this affects their children because these are breadwinners. It means money that is going to support their children's education has also been drastically reduced. I know a couple of countries within SADC have phased out school fees, but here in Zimbabwe, it remains one of the biggest challenges that we have, in a sense that learners continue to pay school fees. Of course, it's utilized at school level, but this creates equity issues because the ability of families to spend then varies from family to family, and eventually this affects quality that children are getting. So if you get kids that are coming from the rich quintile, they have better quality of education because they are paying more fees, and the school affords to buy better teaching and learning materials, better teaching and learning resources, something that you cannot say of learners that are coming from rural schools that are paying an equivalent of maybe say $40 per year, and that is expected to cover all expenses for the school except for the salaries of teachers. So as we move post-COVID, I think there is need for SADC to have a position on elimination of user fees for those countries that are still charging this. I know in Zimbabwe, this could be in retrospect because they've just passed an Education Amendment Act that, now legalizes non-payment of school fees, but there's still steps to go in as far as operationalizing, this is concerned. Then in terms of, building back better, I think there's definitely a need for nations to look at how best we can build back better regarding the time that we have lost. And, already data that we have shows us that sub-Saharan Africa is in what is called a learning crisis, where learners are physically, say, in grade 7, but when you assess the learning content that they have or the knowledge that they have, perhaps it's equivalent to someone who is in grade 5 and so forth. So this was before the post-COVID era. There's a lot of lost time that is there, particularly for learners from, rural schools. So as we build back better, I think there is need for governments to apply not a one-size-fits-all, but to assess and look at issues to do with, evidence-based policy. There's a paper that I did, maybe perhaps it can be circulated to the listeners in the interest of time, in terms of what are some of the benchmarks that government could do in terms of helping schools to build better. In the interest of time, I know we still have other speakers and we have to close. I will look quickly on the issue of the last part on my presentation, which is improving the working conditions of educators. So this is closely linked to the first point, or the points that I mentioned on education financing, and the points that Yantura was mentioning, to say one way of improving the conditions of service of our educators is to relook at what they are paid. And how do we do this? We do this by relooking at what is it that we are committing as governments to education, the whole issue of GDP that we're talking about. Yantura spoke of progressive taxing, where even nations can introduce, say, an education special tax, which is meant, to improve education in general in terms of quality and access, but also, the conditions for teachers. Then another issue, I think, is also to look at how do we professionalize, teaching within the SADC region. And there I propose that one way could be for SADC to come up with regional benchmarks or regional standards that guide the teaching profession, where we say, if you look at a teacher in South Africa, a teacher in Malawi, a teacher in Tanzania, a teacher in Mozambique and other SADC countries, what are the minimum standards that we are looking at? And perhaps this could help us as a region to ensure that we have, we have teachers that are meeting a certain standard, and we need to recognize teachers as professionals. And this could also be done through popularizing the professionalization of teachers through teacher regulatory councils. In South Africa, they have the South African Council of Educators. In Zambia, they've launched the Zambia Teaching Council of Zambia. And perhaps other SADC countries could look at this, and this fits into a regional teacher regulatory body. This is not a teachers union, mind you. Teachers union will continue to be there for issues of conditions of service, but this would be a body that speaks to professional issues and how to improve, the non-salary part of the teacher in terms of, how do we safeguard teaching as a profession. Then lastly, SADC could move towards what West Africa has done, where they now have, regional exams, instead of, Zambia has their own exam, Zimbabwe had their own exam, and so forth. We could look at common examinations that fit or linked to the regional standards that would have prepared for our teachers. So I would think these are some of the, the key pointers that we need to look at. Then there's also the issue of remote learning that is taking place. I think one disadvantage that we have seen, and I'm sure this is not just in Zimbabwe or other countries where I work, is this is a huge disadvantage to learners, particularly from rural backgrounds and those from poor families who do not have access to even things like radio. I was looking at the radio coverage within SADC region. One would assume that is the most common medium of communication, but I was surprised to realize that the average for SADC is less than 60%. So this means that we we are disadvantaging, even if we say there are radio lessons that learners are supposed to, there are still learners that will not be able to access, remote learning, meaning to say, if COVID is to continue, governments need to seriously rethink, how best they can reach the most disadvantaged learners, because as it stands now, online and remote learning that is taking place, the current status quo in SADC would show you that we have a lot of equity gaps because a lot of learners are not accessing, available platforms. I think I'll end here in the interest of time, then I will be able to clarify if there's a slot for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronald, for raising those pertinent points, emphasizing on the issue of financing, highlighting the importance of the teaching profession and remuneration that needs to go with the profession, and also the professionalism of the teaching profession in SADC. He is proposing having a teacher regulatory body at the SADC level, and also emphasizing what other speakers have mentioned earlier about the inequalities that are there in accessing the remote learning. This should apply not only to COVID, but even post-COVID, because not all schools are open, so some children still need to continue learning, and this also needs to be taken into consideration for future pandemics as well. So thank you so much for raising those points and for emphasizing that even for radio coverage, which one would assume would be about 100%, but within SADC, it's only 60% coverage. So we still have a long way to go in the SADC region. So let me go to the next presenter. And our next presenter is an educator, Semo Masaisai. He has 6 years of teaching experience at primary school level. He's the founder and executive director of Young Professional Educators of Zimbabwe, a nonprofit organization which seeks to promote the achievement of equitable and sustainable education in Zimbabwe. He's a holder of a Bachelor of Education in Educational Management and Leadership degree with the Midlands State University in Zimbabwe. So he currently works with Transform Education Movement under the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, ANGAI, in promoting education for the girl child. So Semo is going to talk to us about the curriculum and teachers. So now over to you, Semo.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I hope everyone can hear me very well. I would like to observe the protocol present, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation will address two issues. Firstly, is controlling a curriculum and the recommendations to make a curriculum produce internationally competitive graduates and align it with industry expectations. So there are several factors that control the curriculum, but here are some of the factors and how they should contribute to produce internationally competitive graduates. If I can draw your attention to the philosophy, which is the incumbent government's ideology derived from the ruling party manifesto. They are the leading funders of the education system. So the government of the day now should aim to make the education system to produce graduates who are globally competitive in terms of making political decisions, being patriotic citizens who carry the vision of the country. For example, the graduates who could say, we do not negotiate with terrorists like what we see in American movies. So we want to have strong African political institutions such as AU Army, AU Navy, AU Secret Service who defend Africa with their hearts. And now I'll focus on the socio-economic issues, that is the industry and the society. The industry must control the curriculum, and this implies that the content itself should be derived from the major industries in the country. For example, in Zimbabwe, we have tourism, agriculture, mining, which are the most vibrant industries that we have. So let's look at the aspect of the society. Ladies and gentlemen, knowledge bears the traces of social order of the community, whereby the values, norms, and beliefs emanating from the religion and culture have impact on curriculum change. At this point, you might be wondering why we are not able to fight disasters as a continent, like floods and pandemics. For example, we have 78 trained doctors in Africa right now who should be working on vaccines such as the current COVID-19 pandemic, it is because we always wait for our former colonial masters to bring solutions to us. All we do is singing, follow, 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 follow the leader. All the social distancing and masks are domesticated foreign solutions, but we never gave our traditional healers a chance to put herbs together because the Bible says it's satanic. We should be studying African herbs. Maybe we can call it Bachelor of Science in African Herbology. Our curriculum should be solving local problems with local solutions, and I salute Madagascar for trying. Now let's consider another issue, our value system in Africa, that is a discord. Religion and culture has colonized the curriculum and impacted negatively on the economies of developing countries. We have politicians who focus on trivia. For example, the late president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, who was busy fighting the LGBTIQ people. He expended his term fighting them, but look at the neighboring South Africa. We have the South African Somizi Mhlongo. If the SA curriculum wasn't liberated to accommodate minority class, the whole SADC will not be glued to South African TV channels on DSTV, watching idols, watching generations, etc. Because policymakers in South Africa did not focus on trivia, hence it's a developed country with a thriving entertainment industry with global standards. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to draw your attention to the 10 recommendations to the heads of states in SADC region and Africa, ministers of education, all political players and the youth of SADC here present. If we are to change the curriculum to align it to the industry's expectations and produce international learning, firstly, let's look at the decentralized education system, where management in the sector includes the youth in policy making. Here in Zimbabwe, for example, I cannot be promoted to be a school head or director in the ministry, even if I qualify because I'm not mature enough in terms of years of service. Young technocrats, we have no access to decision making because it should be occupied by the so-called mature people. I would like to move on to policy implementation. It is difficult for young teachers to implement policies that are unexplained to them and that they were not part of during formulation. The bureaucracy in the education system is too much and still maintains the standards of the colonial masters and blocking way for innovations by creative young teachers who are ready to transform education, decolonize the education system, and pave way for curriculum that produce globally competitive graduates. Now I'll focus on political willingness. Policymakers must be willing to work with the young teachers who are qualified so that they help to shape the narrative because youth are in touch with the global trends. Now let's move on to regional or continental curriculum framework. SADC and AU must work on shaping African identity, starting with harmonizing African official language. Aspiration number 5 of the Agenda 2063 says, Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, shared values and ethics, inculcating the spirit of Pan-Africanism, restoring and preserving cultural heritage and its languages. Ladies and gentlemen, language is key to education. If we need a common language, we need a common language for Africa that is used for many projects. For Africa, for example, research purposes to address African problems. There is a vast gap in terms of language in Africa. Harmonizing language is the key step to decolonize African education system from French, Portuguese, and British construct at regional level. Let's talk about establishing functional trade and industry policies. These policies enable African curriculum developers to align the education curriculum standards with the demands of the industry at a continental perspective, so that a graduate from South African university can easily work and develop an industry in Rwanda. Providing resources like scholarships and accessible loans and grants for youth projects and studies. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the AU Pan-African University Scholarship, but the African Union and SADC must launch a new line of scholarships for African students, for youth to do research and other graduate studies. If African youth keep depending on Mastercard Foundation Scholarship, DAAD, and Maxit scholarships, among other foreign scholarships, we remain depending on the governments who were once our colonial masters. Let's move on to the next recommendation, which is comprehensive sexuality education. Undoubtedly, comprehensive sexuality education helps adolescent learners to understand their growth, sexuality, and making sound decisions. This helps to create an education system that enables graduates who appreciate diversity and being different. Apart from this, it should be noted that a government vision must be shared. A vision must be understood by the youth and give them key roles towards its achievement because it is set for them. For example, in Zimbabwe, we have a popular vision 2030. The youth do not have an understanding and involvement in it. Following this, AU must launch an African dream driving the whole continent. Americans are united by their American dream. It is what keeps them powerful nation on earth, and it controls their systems, including the education. Even if you look at their manifestos, they say, yes, we can, making America great again, America for Americans. Come to Africa, we fight and kill each other for food handouts. Our curriculum must nurture our values of a Pan-African dream. Above all, governments must partly own the private public school system by giving shares to private stakeholders who assist in resource mobilization, such as infrastructure development, payment of teachers, furniture, and learning resources. Resources are critical for public institutions to produce globally competitive graduates. Personally, I wanted to be a doctor, but I went to a raw school which wasn't offering science subjects. To this date, my former school has no science subjects and no advanced level classes. So privatizing the public education system or giving shares to educational entrepreneurs, not the government cronies, who decolonize the education system and close the gap between the public and the private schools. For example, the rich, such as children of politicians, write University of Cambridge examinations, running away from the Zimbabwe School Examination Council, and you'll be surprised why policymakers enforcing local examination board run away from it. Let's just domesticate the Cambridge standards and change our curriculum to align it with the industry's expectations and produce internationally competitive graduates. Nelson Mandela says, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And today I say, it is only education if it transforms the world. Africa will rise. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Semo, for that presentation, highlighting on the curriculum and what needs to be done. I want to emphasize one point that has been raised. I think we need to emphasize that education is a public good. So SADC governments need to ensure that they are providing quality public education for its citizens. So governments need to invest in the provision of quality public education so that no child is left behind, because the private sector does not cover the most marginalized children. So we need to bear that in mind, that education needs to be provided by the government. It's the state's responsibility to provide quality education to its citizens. Thank you very much, our presenters, for those very inspiring presentations that you have made. We have just 5 minutes before the end of this session, so I will now check if there are any questions. I can see 2 questions there. There's one that says, how can I participate? Also, I'm a Zimbabwean student. I don't understand that question. If the Velas Caesar, if you'd like to expand on that question, does it mean participating as a panelist, or please clarify for me? The second question, I think, is for Yandu, not Yandura, but for this is for Ronald. Would conducting similar assessments in the SADC then eliminate the need for SADC countries to participate in international assessments like the PIRLS? So I would like to ask Ronald to respond to that question. And Velas, if you can just clarify the question you have put there for me.
Hello, thank you for the question. So in terms of regional examinations, I think one strength that we will achieve is, we obviously there is strengthening of our quality standards as countries will seek, to meet regional benchmarks, and the whole issue of regional integration is where nations are already going. Seymour was talking of how much governments, or private or parents are paying to meet an international standard, which is Cambridge. I was talking to the Deputy Minister of Education in Botswana the other time, and he was indicating that there is need for SADC to come together and have our own, so that people don't yearn for standards like Cambridge. So obviously there's the issue of strengthening our systems and jointly addressing challenges that are common to SADC region through education, be they in terms of STEM and so forth. But it doesn't really eliminate the idea of countries taking part in international assessments. I think international assessments like like PISA, like SACMEC, they help us to benchmark our systems against also international standards to see how we compare as SADC region, perhaps maybe to OECD countries. So I think, by having regional exams, it doesn't necessarily mean we don't take part in international assessments, because international assessments help us to gauge our standards. I hope in short,
Okay, thank you very much for that response. The other one is the comment, and I'll take the last question, which is in French, but I'll just say it in English because I speak French too. What's the common language if it's not Swahili? I think this one is for you, Seymour, so be ready to answer that one. Swahili identifies us better than the other languages, the other languages that we inherited from the colonizers. That's a question for you. He's asking that if it is not Swahili, what other language?
Thank you very much for that question. From my understanding, I have walked through corridors of policy making arenas. I have understood that for Africa, most African languages, they emanated from the Swahili. So I think the Swahili is the official language for Africa. I hope the question has been addressed well. You are muted.
Sorry, she was wondering whether you are proposing another language apart from Swahili. No, okay. All right, so we have just 2 minutes. And before I conclude the session, I would like to ask our co-chairs if they have something to say before I conclude the session. Are you there, our co-chairs for the committee? Pearl? It seems they are not there. Okay, if they are not there, then I will conclude. In this session, what I have gotten out from the presentations from the presenters, sorry, before I go to that, do any of the presenters have any final words?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Just
okay, maybe
1 minute each.
Okay, 1 minute for me is just too much. I would propose the use of sign language as well as an official language for Africa, because we have people with disabilities. They need to be included in the curriculum. So sign language must be an official language as well, alongside with the Swahili. Thank you.
Thank you. Sign language is a must because we need to include everyone. We are not supposed to leave anyone behind. Yes, thank you. Yandura, Ronald, any last words?
Yeah, for me, investing in education is key to sustainable development and also harnessing the demographic dividend. We cannot have a future without education. So there is need for us as youth to hold our hands together and hold our governments to account for the provision of quality, inclusive, and accessible education. Thank you.
Thanks, Yandura. Ronald, any last words?
Nothing from my end. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. So in conclusion, what I can say is from what has been presented by the presenters is that if we are to build back better, it cannot be business as usual, the way it was before. We still had millions of children, and in particular girls, who were excluded from education. So as we are building back better, we need more equitable, more inclusive education systems. So it is also time to seriously put efforts to close the digital divide, as has been highlighted by the presenters. We also need to ensure that we safeguard the financial resources for education, increase the size of the budget through the action on fair tax, and ensure that countries are not reducing their spending on education. And we also need to ensure that debt servicing is addressed. As we have heard that there's a lot of, Africa is in a lot of debt, and countries have to take action to ensure that the debt burden is being reduced so that it does not affect the provision of public services, which include education. So with those words, I would like to thank you all for your participation in this session. And I hope that the youth who have participated in this session will take forward the recommendations that have been made and ensure that you are doing advocacy in your respective countries to ensure that there's quality, inclusive public education being offered to all the children in the countries within SADC. Thank you all very much.